Now, let's come to this point. So now we have established that the reason that celiac disease happens is as a result of grain. We've established as well that regional ileitis or Crohn's disease, we've also established other inflammatory bowel diseases are contributed to by grain. We've established that beriberi and pellagra, nutritional deficiency diseases, are killing thousands of people a year as a result of the malnourishing, the malnourishing effect of eating processed cereals. And now I want to give you a little kind of historical perspective on the quantitative production of grain. So we're moving past the 1950s. You can see in this chart, we start in 1960 and we're moving through 2020. And we can see here, and this is millions of metric tons of grain produced. And so you can see up here in the top, you've got corn. And so you can see what happens with corn is from 1961 to 2019-20, the millions of metric tons of corn production have increased 5.5 times, from 205 million metric tons to 1,148. So we see something similar with rice, from 285 to 755, as well with wheat. You see almost 3.5 times greater, from 222 to 768. Barley doubles from 72 to 159. Sorghum increases. Millet increases a little bit. Oats actually surprisingly are cut down. Triticale goes up. Rye goes down just a little bit, but the vast majority go up, right? So you got predominantly rice and corn and wheat and barley as being some of the biggest, most commonly produced. So we're now producing massive quantities. And how can we do this? How can we go and take this production to such great heights? This is where, you know, in comes GMO. We got new pesticides. We're developing technology that allows farmers to not have to work as hard, these big combines and other big machines that allow for large swaths of planting. And so we're able to ramp up production with these different technologies coming onto the scene. And so that brings us to the point of, you know, if we look at since 1974, what have we seen happen? So a lot of people say, well, why wasn't celiac disease around? Why wasn't gluten sensitivity around, you know, years ago when I was growing up? And it was around. It's just that we have so much more production of grain. Remember what I said earlier is that 50% of total calories comes from wheat in the US. And so when we see an increase quantitatively in how much people are eating, and we see these cereal companies just basically pawning cereal off on our children as if it's the bee's knees, we get massive increase in total caloric intake coming from grain. And you can see here, just in the US, statistically speaking, an increase of celiac disease since 1974 to today, a 5-fold increase. So we've increased it in part because we've increased this, right? And if you think of gluten, it's not like this all or none thing. It's not like the more you eat, if you're gluten sensitive, the more you poison yourself. The less you eat, the less you poison yourself. And so when you increase it as a staple food in a diet of a culture, you're going to see an epidemic shift toward a trend in disease development. And what we know about gluten particularly, and gluten is not just in wheat, but it's in other grains as well, is we know that it is the #1 cause of autoimmune disease. It's the #1 most well-researched and well-studied trigger for autoimmune disease. And most people understand that as it relates to celiac disease, but unfortunately, very few, and this is true even in the medical field, very few doctors are aware of the overwhelming amount of research on the implication of gluten consumption and the induction of other autoimmune diseases. There's a connection with type 1 diabetes. There's a connection with autoimmune hepatitis and polyendocrine problems and infertility issues and pericarditis and myocarditis and ankylosing spondylitis and rheumatoid arthritis and psoriatic arthritis and eczema and psoriasis and autoimmune diseases of the brain like bipolar and schizophrenia. And so we have this long list of autoimmune diseases that we know gluten can help trigger. Gluten's not the only trigger for autoimmune disease, so let's be careful not to just place blame only on gluten for this, but we definitely have to look at it. So again, this is a trend that's happening. Remember, we look at, because again, a lot of you ask me the question, this is since 1974, so we got a 5-fold increased risk. When did glyphosate become heavily used on grain? It was in the early 1990s. So we were seeing this 5-fold increased risk, okay, before glyphosate was being used on crops. So I want to emphasize that, because a lot of you think, hey, I'm just going to go to Europe and I'm going to eat all the grain I want. I get this question so frequently that I wanted to make sure I was addressing it. And then we have this too. This is a recent meta-analysis on incidence of celiac disease. You can see here is increasing over time. And this is not just US data, but what we're looking at is a kind of a data set from 1950 to the year 2020. And so if you go back again to the timeline, we didn't even know what caused celiac disease. We didn't even know how to diagnose it or what caused it until 1953, right? So this is why we're starting here with what looks like low numbers. And probably if we went back to the year 1900, we would have some kind of a plot graph where we could show it, but we just didn't have enough grain in the human diet to see mass quantities. And it wasn't until, again, those early 1900s where cereal was becoming more and more common and more available in households. And it really wasn't until the 1940s when this took off. And so if you think of it from that perspective, and then you look at this graph and this plot, you can see tremendous increase. And it's not just in the US. So a lot of you say, well, I can go to Europe and I can eat and I can eat the pasta or cereal and I don't feel as bad. I'm not saying you're wrong, and I'm not saying your experience is incorrect. I'm just saying if you're gluten sensitive, that's a very dangerous statement to make, because gluten can still damage you. And we look at Italy, for example, in the purple, and you can see their incidence rates have gone way up too. You look at Italy, Italy's much higher moving through history, and they're not using glyphosate. So again, this isn't just a story of glyphosate. A lot of you want to blame that pesticide as the reason for all of the increase in all of these different chronic diseases and conditions. And I don't think that we can do that, because you can see many of these European countries, including New Zealand, their incidence of celiac disease is skyrocketing since 1950. And glyphosate isn't the only thing that can explain that. So very important that you understand that, especially if you want to keep your health. Let's talk about autoimmune disease as a whole. I mentioned earlier that gluten was the #1 most well-studied cause or trigger for autoimmune disease, and we can see in this diagram published from New England Journal in 2002, and it's not all forms of autoimmune disease, but you can see multiple sclerosis, Crohn's, type 1 diabetes, and asthma are the 4 forms of autoimmune disease that are being listed in this diagram, and you can see big increases in all of these. And so again, where did glyphosate come into the scene? Right here. But when did we start seeing increases? Way back here, right? So this is not a glyphosate issue. This is, in my opinion, this is definitely a in part a gluten issue, but also in part an increased or ramped up production of grains. There's also hybridization of grains and manipulation of grains in other ways. The use of nitrogen and monocropping are all, I think, contributing to this. But the other aspect to this is, the other kind of 10,000-pound elephant in the room is processed chemicals. So beyond pesticides, what are our children being exposed to in mass? They're being exposed to, and not just our children, all of us as well, but there are 30,000 chemicals in use today that haven't been adequately studied. 3,000 of them are approved in our food. Multiple of them are approved in what we put on our food. And so these chemicals are part of the equation. What else is part of this equation? The chemicals that children are being injected with. So, you've got, if you understand the history, we won't get into the history of vaccination tonight, but if we go back, it was around 1943 that we started introducing this right here. And then when we got to somewhere in the 1986, I believe it was, we took away liability from these guys. We took away manufacturing liability so that they could no longer be sued. And so then the vaccine schedule went way up and increased dramatically. So we have this huge increase in the number of these given to babies. I think it went from, like, don't quote me on this, 6 or 7 by the age of 2 to somewhere around 24 shots before the age of 2, again with that loss of liability, the schedule changed, and so we were pumping babies full of so many different chemicals and a lot of these vaccines, and we could argue, debate the merits of vaccines if you'd like, but the biggest issue here isn't the merit of whether they work, it's the actual adjuvants. The adjuvants in them are different chemicals, again, that we're pumping directly in through this, past the skin, into the child. And so we're getting a bulk of exposures to different chemicals, and we're bypassing the innate immune system of tiny babies that can't talk, they can't speak for themselves, they can't tell you how they feel. All they can do is cry or die, possibly. And so again, these are all other factors on this timeline. You've got chemical exposures, you've got an increase in these here, and so we see this trend, and we see the same trend not just with these forms of autoimmune disease, but we see this with Hashimoto's disease. We see this with the rheumatological diseases like lupus. So this trend, very, very much as a timeline perspective, we can correlate increased grain consumption, but to the increased rise in autoimmune disease. We can correlate increased antibiotic use. That's the other thing that I would point out, is antibiotic use also became more widespread in the 1940s and on and forward. And there are many very intelligent scientists that believe the antibiotic combined with hygiene, overwashing of hands, overutilization of chemicals in the name of hygiene, led to basically a rise in autoimmune disease, and they refer to this as the hygiene hypothesis, which is we're too clean and we're not being exposed to enough germs, and because of that, our immune systems aren't getting proper training, and what they're being trained against are things that are very, very foreign. So our immune systems are appropriately behaving in a manner that's consistent with creating inflammation and driving forward the process of chronic inflammatory autoimmune diseases. And so again, we can correlate that with grain consumption. We can correlate that with hyper use of antibiotics. We can correlate that with more chemicals and more vaccines. So again, I don't want to only just look at cereal and blame cereal for everything as an end-all be-all cause, but I think it's important that you understand the history, because again, if we kind of summarize, we didn't even have cereal before 1895. It didn't really exist to any great amount in any household, and it really wasn't until the 1930s, 1940s where we saw processed cereal foods becoming major staples, and where we saw the cereal manufacturers and companies really target women and children in their ads, because women were the primary caretakers of the home. They're the ones that went to the grocery store and bought the products. The kids were the ones that really were targeted the most with cartoon characters in a very manipulative way. And so here we are today, where the average person in the US and in other industrialized countries today believes that cereal is a necessity, that grain is a necessity in the human diet. And the fact of the matter is it's not. In prior 1900, grain was part of the human diet in the US, but it was a much, much smaller part. And so this is one of the reasons why we don't see earlier on in the history of our country the rapid quantity or growth of autoimmune disease, because this was not being used as a staple food. Grains were not being used as a staple food. So there you have it. Thanks for joining me for the Dr. Osborne Zone, and make sure you pump your questions into the feed tonight so that I can answer them for you at Thursday, 12:30 Central Standard Time. And you can join me then as well. I'll be answering questions live. Thanks and take care.